Fear has a way of creeping in quietly. It doesn't always come with loud alarms or flashing signs. Sometimes it slips in through the small cracks, an unexpected setback, a harsh word, an uncertain future. It settles into the corners of your heart, whispering, "What if you're not enough?" Or, "What if everything falls apart?" But here's the truth that fear doesn't want you to remember. Faith is stronger, always. Faith isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to believe in something greater, even when fear feels overwhelming. It's standing in the middle of uncertainty and saying, "I don't know what's ahead, but I know who's with me." Fear tries to shrink your world, to keep you small, to convince you that you're powerless. But faith expands your vision. It lifts your eyes beyond the what-ifs and toward the one who holds it all together. Think about a child learning to ride a bike. There's fear in the wobbling, in the possibility of falling. But there's also trust, the belief that someone is there to catch them if they fall, to help them get back up. That's what faith is. Not the absence of fear, but the courage to move forward despite it, trusting that God's got you. Fear says, "What if I fail?" Faith says, "Even if I do, I'm not alone." Fear says, "I can't handle this." Faith says, "Maybe I can't, but God can." The reality is, you'll face fear. We all do. But fear doesn't get the final word. Faith does. Not because you're fearless, but because you've decided that your faith is louder than your fear. Even if it's just a whisper, even if it's shaky, even if all you can manage is a fragile, "I believe," that's enough. So when fear comes knocking, and it will, don't open the door and invite it in. Stand firm. Hold on to faith. Not because you've got it all figured out, but because you know the one who does. And his love? It casts out fear every single time. Fear often feels like a giant, towering over you, casting long shadows across your heart. It convinces you that the worst is inevitable, that you're too small to face what's ahead. But faith isn't about being the strongest person in the room. It's about trusting the one who is. Faith doesn't mean you won't feel afraid. It means you choose to believe in spite of your fear. It's standing on shaky legs, with trembling hands and saying, "I'm scared, but I'm moving forward anyway." Fear wants you stuck, paralyzed by what-ifs. But faith whispers, "Even if, I will trust." Think about David facing Goliath. He wasn't the biggest. He wasn't the strongest. But he had faith, not in his own abilities, but in God's power. David didn't defeat Goliath because he was fearless. He defeated him because his faith was bigger than his fear. That's the key. It's not about eliminating fear. It's about growing your faith so strong that fear no longer controls you. Fear says, "Stay where it's safe." Faith says, "Step out. I'm with you." Fear says, "You're not enough." Faith says, "You were never meant to be enough on your own. I've got you." Life will give you plenty of reasons to be afraid: uncertainty, failure, rejection, loss. But for every fear, God has given a promise. When fear says, "You're alone," faith declares, "God will never leave you." When fear whispers, "You can't do this," faith shouts, "I can do all things through him who gives me strength." You see, faith isn't just an idea, it's a weapon. Not one that denies fear exists, but one that refuses to let fear win. Even when you're afraid, even when the path is unclear, faith allows you to take the next step. Not because you're fearless, but because you know God is bigger than whatever you're facing. So today, if fear is trying to control the narrative, change the story. Speak faith over your fear. Even if your voice shakes, even if your heart races, declare, "I am not defined by my fear. I am held by my faith. And that faith? It's enough to move mountains. Fear loves to paint worst-case scenarios in the canvas of your mind. It thrives in uncertainty, feeding on what-ifs and magnifying your doubts. What if I fail? What if things never get better? What if I'm not enough? These thoughts can feel overwhelming, paralyzing even. But here's the truth. Faith isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to move forward despite it. Faith over fear doesn't mean fear disappears. It means you've chosen to trust something greater than the fear itself. Faith says, even if I don't know what's next, I know who holds the future. It's that quiet confidence that rises, not because everything is perfect, but because you believe God's promises are stronger than your circumstances. Think of Peter stepping out of the boat. The storm was raging, the waves were high, and fear was real. But Peter's faith wasn't about the calm. It was about trusting Jesus in the chaos. He walked on water not because there was no fear, but because he kept his eyes on the one who calms the storm. That's faith, not in the absence of fear, but in the presence of trust. Fear says, what if I sink? Faith says, if I do, God will catch me. Fear says, the storm is too big. Faith says, my God is bigger. The battle between fear and faith is often fought in your mind. What you focus on grows. If you focus on the fear, it gets louder. But if you shift your focus to God, His goodness, His promises, His faithfulness, faith begins to rise. Not because your situation changes overnight, but because your perspective does. You don't have to pretend you're fearless. It's okay to feel afraid, but don't let fear make decisions for you. Don't let it be the loudest voice in the room. When fear says, you can't, let faith remind you, God can. When fear says you're alone, let faith whisper, I will never leave you. So today, when fear shows up, and it will, don't fight it with your strength. Fight it with faith. Speak truth louder than the lies. Stand firm, not because you're unshaken, but because you know the one who holds you is unshakable. And in His presence, fear doesn't stand a chance. Fear often disguises itself as wisdom. It whispers, be careful, don't take that risk. What if you fail? What if you get hurt? It convinces you that staying safe, staying small, and staying in control will protect you. But here's the thing. Faith isn't about living without caution. It's about refusing to let fear make the final decision. Faith over fear is a daily choice. It's not a one-time declaration, but a continuous act of surrender. Fear thrives on what's uncertain, but faith thrives on what's unchanging. God's promises. It's not about pretending the fear doesn't exist. It's about facing it head-on with the belief that God's presence is greater than anything you'll face. Think of Joshua standing before the walls of Jericho. The city was fortified, the obstacles impossible. Fear could have said, this wall will never fall. But faith said, if God is with us, no wall can stand against us. Joshua didn't have all the answers. He had no battle plan that made sense in human terms, but he had a promise, and that was enough. Fear says, the wall is too high. Faith says, God's power is higher. Fear says, this situation is impossible. Faith says, with God, all things are possible. It's easy to focus on the size of the problem, but faith shifts your focus to the size of your God. Fear will tell you to look at the waves, but faith will remind you to keep your eyes on the one who walks on water. Fear says, what if? But faith boldly responds, even if. You're not weak because you feel afraid. You're strong because you choose to stand anyway. Every time you show up, every time you say yes to the unknown, every time you trust God even when you're trembling. That's faith. That's courage. That's victory. So today, if fear is loud in your heart, let faith speak louder. Don't let fear write your story. Hand the pen to God and watch how He turns your fear into testimony, your doubt into trust, your weakness into strength. Because at the end of the day, faith always wins. Not because we're fearless, but because God is faithful. Fear often feels like a shadow, following you wherever you go. It's there when you wake up, whispering doubts. It's there when you face challenges, convincing you to shrink back. But here's the truth. Shadows only exist because there's light nearby. And that light is faith. Faith that shines even in the darkest places. Faith over fear isn't about pretending everything is okay. It's about believing that even when things aren't okay, God is still in control. Fear will try to convince you that your circumstances define your future. But faith says, my circumstances don't have the final word. God does. Think of Moses standing at the edge of the Red Sea. Behind him was Pharaoh's army, charging with fury. In front of him was an impossible wall of water. Fear said, you're trapped. There's no way out. But faith said, stand still and watch what God will do. And God made a way where there was no way. Fear says, you're surrounded. Faith says, God goes before me and behind me. Fear says, there's no way through this. Faith says, God makes a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. The truth is, fear will always try to have a seat at the table. It will knock on the door of your heart, especially when you're stepping into something new, facing uncertainty, or walking through a storm. But you don't have to invite it in. You can acknowledge the fear without giving it control. Faith isn't about being fearless. It's about who you turn to when fear shows up. It's choosing to trust God's promises over your feelings. It's standing firm, even when your knees are shaking. It's believing that even when life feels out of control, God is never out of control. So today, whatever you're facing, whether it's a battle, a burden, or a big unknown, choose faith. Not because it's easy, but because it's worth it. Speak truth over the lies. Declare hope over the doubt. Let your faith be louder than your fear. Because when God is with you, fear doesn't stand a chance. At the heart of every fear is a question. What if? What if I fail? What if I'm not enough? What if things never get better? Fear feeds on the unknown, convincing you that the worst is always just around the corner. But here's the truth. Faith doesn't need to have all the answers to move forward. Faith simply says, even if I don't know what's next, I know who's in control. Faith over fear isn't a one-time victory. It's a daily choice. Some days, faith feels strong and unshakable. Other days, it's a quiet whisper, barely louder than your doubts. But even the smallest seed of faith can move mountains. It's not the size of your faith that matters. It's the size of the God you're trusting. Think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego standing before the fiery furnace. Fear was real. The flames were real. But their response wasn't rooted in fear. It was rooted in faith. They said, our God can save us. But even if He doesn't, we will not bow. That's faith over fear. Not because they knew the outcome, but because they trusted God no matter the outcome. Fear says, what if I lose everything? Faith says, even if I do, God is still enough. Fear says, what if the worst happens? Faith says, even then, God will carry me through. Life will always present situations that trigger fear. Uncertainty, change, loss, failure. But fear doesn't have to define you. You were created for more than survival. You were created to live fully, boldly, with courage rooted in faith. Not because you're fearless, but because God's love is greater than your fear. The Bible says, perfect love casts out fear. That's not a poetic idea. It's a powerful truth. When you're anchored in God's love, fear loses its grip, because His love is constant, unchanging, and bigger than anything you'll face. So today, whatever fear is knocking at your heart, don't answer with worry. Answer with faith. Speak life over your fear. Declare God's promises louder than the lies. You are not defined by your fears. You are held by your faith. And the one who holds you? He has never lost a battle.